Welcome to Beyond the Plinth, the show about biokinetics and everything health and wellness orientated. I'm Steve Saunders, your host, and with me as always is
Natasha Deley, the current Vice President of the Biokinetic Association of South Africa.
We call her Tash. I call it Natasha and then she thinks she's in trouble. And today as our special guest we have...
I'm Kelly Frames. I'm a biokineticist in 4 ways, and I have a special interest in sports injuries.
Brilliant. So today we're discussing the topic of sports injuries, rehabilitation, and the role biokineticists play within that sphere. It's a sphere pretty close to my heart. I can't survive life without a bit of sport and a bit of training. And typically being A-type personality, obsessive compulsive, and inability to listen to anyone's advice, I will get injured. This is where you fit in. In that final phase rehab, it may be acute injury recovery. It may be just basic injury or overuse injuries of some sort, but I'm sure we'll get an opportunity to talk about all of these.
Yeah, so I guess I will ask your first question. Mine is we often get asked what separates bios from other sports professionals. And I think something to keep in mind or bear in mind is the clinical aspect behind it, is the scientific education that we have and the application of that into a sports environment from a physical activity point of view. Kelly can probably elaborate a bit more because she has a very fancy machine that she uses in her practice for all her sports people.
Well, other people as well, but mainly for sports people. Yeah, so you isolate the muscles around a joint and you can measure how much strength each muscle is contributing and what ratio, and see if there's a muscle imbalance between left and right sides. And then you have some idea of where you need to work on. For athletes, you're looking at a little bit of a higher normative value than for your average population. And yeah, it's nice for the athletes to see as well because it puts it on a nice graph and you can say, okay, well, this muscle is weak here on your left-hand side compared to your right-hand side, and we must do this and this and this. And usually with athletes, they're very good at listening, and to a point where they overdo it and you have to say, okay, stop now.
Yes.
We have both extremes.
Yeah, it's fancy and it does give us a lot of information.
So it goes into a little bit about biokinetics, which is about the objective, the measurable, the data, being able to draw that data down and make decisions around the data. That's what makes you different to most of the other, if I can say it, the generalized, more the population I would sit in as a practitioner, where it's not as measured. We're not as clinical as you guys are, but you guys are able to draw down that clinical data. I'm going to pull you back a little bit and go a little bit back into your history. So what brought you into deciding that biokinetics, 1, was a passion, and 2, the sports area as a second avenue?
I actually played quite a lot of hockey at school, and it was weird. I got shin splints.
I was about to say, how are your knees?
Yeah, no, they
and ankles and shins.
And but I had to go and see a bio when I was at school because too hard, too fast, and changed my life, I guess. I decided this was the coolest thing, and I was also on a Biodex, but similar sort of machine, and I was sold. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
So that got you
started
into...
It's our new slogan. It changes lives.
Changes lives. Yes, biokineticists change lives. Yeah. So hockey was the main sport. The injuries from overuse, I mean, hockey being one of those quite explosive, quick change of direction type sports. Typical injuries you see from hockey?
Barring the concussions and head wounds.
Connection with a stick.
Yeah, lots of knee injuries, sprains, strains, ankle injuries, a lot of back pain because of the positioning. So I'd say those are the sort of top ones, but it could also just be a freak accident.
No, I had to stop because of my back.
Really?
I laid right up into my late 30s, and I had to stop.
It's intense.
I was about to say, you're only 27, aren't you?
Oh, you can stay anytime.
Who said Kelly's using that all over lake cream?
Yeah.
The skin. Awesome.
No, I'm old now.
Yeah. Okay, so the hockey gave you that experience and that ability to see, or the opportunity to see the abilities that come out of the biokineticist, the treatment opportunity, and how it's helped you. Are you still playing hockey?
No, I too have had ankle injuries and knee injuries and back injuries. So now I just fix the injuries. Yeah.
And what's your advice to those that are playing?
Prevention is better than cure, I guess. Work smart, not hard, train the muscles. You see, bio wasn't around in our schools, and this is, I think, where it's also a missing link. If you train it properly and, if you sort the imbalances out and there's a proper training program for you, then I think you avoid a lot of the injuries and you play better, I think.
Yeah. So
and there's also a lot to be said for, that science is evolving. Part of that is the way that we perform and how our bodies move. And, what we used to do in school in a PE session is definitely not what's being done now, because there's so much more to being free to move and to move in a correct biomechanical way. So I think that's, from a sports injury point of view, it's important to understand how your body moves, why it moves the way it does, and how to make sure that you are conditioning it to suit your skill. So if you're choosing cycling or running or swimming, it's not a bad idea to go to someone to assess what your biomechanical motion is like and see whether you're actually doing your body more harm or not. So, yeah, I think from that point of view, I think it's important for people to understand,
Yeah, it's going to be, we chatted on one of the other episodes about kids as special population group development and schools and such, like hockey, a major sport within schools, and the kids are going through this fast development process within schools for their particular sport. And if they're not grounded properly with the basic skills and ability, the proprioception and such, like, they are going to be at greater risk for injury within a sport that exposes them to that environment.
I think at school you definitely do see, your quite a lot of injuries to the athletes, but it becomes a whole bigger issue when it's at professional level. There's so much more riding on the athlete in itself, and it's then having to work with the rest of the team, with the sports dietitian, the strength and conditioning coach, the physiotherapist. So it opens up a whole different avenue to dealing with the athlete's injuries.
Brilliant. Yeah. So the topic I'm leading to is we've got the school development, the opportunities, the sports that are typical within the schools, and then the athlete goes out into the market and a whole lot of other activities then open up. And you see sports like cycling, triathlon, running take over where they weren't necessarily sports they were doing as focused sports in school. How do you find the range of injuries and customer, client, patient base changes with the age groups?
Sure. I think at school, it's your typical rugby, hockey, soccer, cycling. But then when you start with Ironman, triathletes, things like that, it's so much bigger. Where someone would come to you with a knee injury, then because they're swimming, then it's a shoulder injury as well. And then you've got to try and rehab multiple different body parts at a higher level because they're training and they're pushing for an event and they need to get back to something as soon as possible. So it's dealing with a whole host of other injuries and a whole host of other or a bit more pressure.
I think also, sorry to cut you off, is that's where the scope of biokinetics comes in quite well. Is because we trained in so many various aspects of these different issues. It's almost like you're going to a one-stop shop.
Yes.
You don't have to go to 3 different people to fix 3 different issues. Our clinical background and our training is designed to be able to do a multidisciplinary approach in a team setup as well. So looking at working with a physio and a chiro and whether it's your team doctor or your strength and conditioning coach. I think what's nice as a bio is that we get to look at a holistic approach to everything. So from the top down, not from the bottom up. We're not looking at each thing individually because you're not rehabbing one thing at a time. You have to look at the person moving as a whole because they're doing 3 different disciplines if
Absolutely.
It's the case of a triathlete.
And quite often they've come into triathlon later in life. They haven't developed up as a youngster in triathlon. They've developed up as a soccer player, hockey player, whatever it is, and suddenly they're having to do this single plane immersion type, repetitive, many hours type activity. And I'm sure you're going to see lots of those overuse injuries probably more dominant than necessarily the acute injuries, or am I wrong there?
No, I think you're correct. The more you do, the more injury you open yourself up to.
So what's the moral of the story?
Mine would be it's the ego more than anything. I think people want to prove at 40 and 50 they can do what they were doing when they were 20. And instead of sticking to one, they want to put all three together. So, I think there's a psychological aspect to the training as well.
Brilliant. That's exactly what I'm drawing for. Is what are you playing with here, and how are you helping? Because when you talk about biodex or isokinetic training or anything like that, they're quite specific modules. But there's a whole sphere around this individual that you're dealing with. And being someone who's done sport, who understands a bit about the sports psychology side, a bit about all the intervention areas this person's engaging, the fact that they've probably got a coach who doesn't have anywhere near the amount of education they probably should have for the amount of training they're handing out. And I say this in an environment, I come from the coaching commission in a cycling environment where we look at the coaches and we're trying to figure out how do we categorize these coaches. They say self-labeled coaches. You guys come from a clinically monitored environment where you're limited in what your scope of practice is. You know that limit and you practice within that limit, and you effect changes within that limit as well. And then you know where the profession sit outside of that. But a lot of these athletes that are coming to you from areas where you've got to be able to read in how much extra training or whatever has been put onto them as athletes from an area that may not have any clinical understanding of the effect of that type of exercise. Do you find a resistance on some of the advice modules you may be giving?
No, because I find, mostly no. Athletes listen to you a bit more so than any other person, or I find. They want to get better because they're pushing for something, but they also want to learn themselves and know and be involved and push it. But you also get the OCD type A person who's gone and researched from Google, or Wikipedia, who doesn't quite hit the spot, and they're talking absolute nonsense, and you've got to try and correct them without bruising an ego.
Yes.
So it's a bit of a fine line of trying to apply the science and educate and say, okay, well, it's this muscle and this is how it works and here are the biomechanics of it, but in a way that they'll apply it and then they can take that with them going forward to be better.
So brilliant. So talking about this A-type personality, obsessive compulsive, they've made a fair amount of money and they're now invested in their sport. They're older. They know their stuff. They typically are higher up in the hierarchy in their working environment. So they're used to telling people what to do. How many of those do you see in this market?
A lot.
Yeah, I see quite a few as well.
It happens, and I actually... It's difficult because you've got to suck it up and try and put it professionally, I guess. And
I think at the end of the day, they respect that they've come to you because there's some form of professionalism that they just don't know or don't understand.
Yes.
So at the same time, I'm not going to go to someone down the road who I think can do teeth when I'd go to a dentist. You know what I mean? So at some point in the mind, there's a section where you've got to be like, okay, I have to go to a professional because there's only so much I can do and there's only so much I can read. And coming back to your previous statement, I wouldn't discredit experience, so as much as you talk about coaches, and it's people who've walked the walk, talk the talk, have been there, have had podiums or not, lost out on gold medals or not, so I think that is important, as a coach to work with someone like a biokineticist, or to be open to understand that a team event or a team multidisciplinary approach is always going to be the best for the patient. We take an oath at HBCSA that the patient's always going to be the main goal. Yes. It's not about me and my profession. It's not about the physio and their profession or the chiro. It's about what is the best for the patient.
Yes.
And if that's how we all practice, then technically there's room for everyone to be able to work together and to build a sportsman to the best of his ability.
And within a highly competitive arena like sports, this is a very different topic to dealing with, say, kids or pregnancy or something like that, because the person is dealing with something they don't have and they want. It's not something they necessarily had. They're all aiming at a goal that's ahead of them. And an athlete never settles for what they've already achieved. It's what they want to achieve. And that becomes part of the control mechanisms. How do you keep control of those? How do you put the limits in place that they understand what they're doing? But also, how do you get them to continually manage on the advice you've given them? The range of motion, the proprioception, the activation, all of those factors are important in injury prevention going forward.
Well, I think it's also about reading the athlete as a person, because I think athletes are different, and what affects you is not going to affect someone else, or vice versa. So I think it's that ability to read the person itself. So it's hard, especially in the athletic world, when a split second can make or break you. It can be the difference between first place or second place, and nobody remembers second place. So
yes, first loser. Did I say that
to
out
put
loud?
it nicely.
And that's when they come see you with that injury.
Yeah.
Because that's the psychology playing through.
I think as someone who I think we also forget as bios that you get so involved and so engrossed in the person doing well, because their success ends up being yours as well. You wanna you give in so many areas. I think that as I've never been a professional sports person, provincial levels as far as I've gone, but I'm just saying, like, you understand the hard work and dedication that's put into it, and for
the
them
role
to
of a
buy
team.
in. Yes, the team thing, I think for me, is actually the most important. You can do so much on your own or so much with a professional, but as soon as you open up to hearing and understanding what a group working together can give you, you move leaps and bounds in your profession. I'm talking now as a sports athlete. It's
absolutely. So as part of that sort of team that's going to be supporting an athlete, Kelly, your experience with the big teams, experience at that level, injury prevention, what's it like dealing with those really top-end athletes?
It's interesting. I think it's a different level. Everything is just bigger, higher. The stakes are higher. So they're pushing higher. We're pushing higher. The injuries tend to be a little bit more severe. It's the thrill of the game, I guess.
Yeah. It's sort of the avenue I've noticed in engaging with those elite teams is amazing to see how focused those athletes are. They go to the office to practice their sport, to do their sport. They go to the bio, to the physio, to the strapping person within the team. It's all part of their daily routine as if they're at the office, and that's what they do for 8 to 10 hours a day. And people don't see that side of it. So the elite team side of it, and I'm mentioning that just as an example of what it's like to deal with them, because they come in with a huge amount of focus, a huge amount of understanding of what it means to be injured. They never want to be injured, but they're always at the knife edge of injury. They're pushing so hard.
It is such a higher game, and you understand sort of why things like doping comes into it when the athletes are pushing so much, and that's a whole different spectrum. But that is who they are, and that's what they're pushing for, and that is the day they live. So it's what drives them. So you kind of have to understand that sort of motivation behind it and work towards it. So it's different to working with someone with Parkinson's or something like that.
You've got an extreme population here.
I think also, like in our practice, we've noticed your program becomes way more accelerated. So you have an accelerated program for sportsmen because you can't take the 8 to 10 weeks like you would in a concussion injury, or you don't have the luxury of time.
Yes.
So you're managing an expectation from a coach, from a team, to the own person's expectations of themselves, to meet certain targets, to meet certain goals. And that, I think it's quite a lot of pressure on them, which ultimately falls onto the bio.
Yes.
To make sure that you are managing that program well within their means and having to have the hard conversation. So if you're not ready, you're not ready.
Yep.
I think that's been the hardest part of one of the two people that I've trained at high level is to tell them, I'm sorry, but if I let you go, you're going to be out longer than you would if you had to just wait another 2-3 weeks, So miss one game for the sake of the rest of the season or miss the rest of the season.
Yes.
What would you like to do? So it's tough. It's, sportsmen in general, managing expectation, managing psychology, managing eating, managing training, family, everything. It's like...
But you know what? You got to manage what they do on the side as well. Because I've worked with athletes that they tell you, yeah, I've done this, this, and this, and this only. But then they go to gym and then they start doing other things at the gym.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring it into the last little topic and then try and wrap it up for you. But the sphere, the influence of biokinetics is quite diverse, but within sport it goes right up to the top level, and there is almost not a sport or a team I know of that doesn't have a biokineticist involved in their daily operation. The ability to make sure the team, which is the product of that business, is operating at an optimal level. And from you mention any franchise in cricket, rugby, soccer, netball, hockey, cycling, triathlon, whatever it is you want to mention. Maybe chess doesn't have it yet, but I'm sure they will.
No, actually, I train some of the grandmasters of chess, and it falls well within their scope to be physically active for their mind.
Yeah.
Believe it or not.
Well, there we go. So there isn't a sphere that biokineticists don't have an influence within those environments. And when you get to the top, those athletes who are those obsessive compulsive A-type personality, they have a serious objective, but they're pushing themselves beyond a level anyone else has ever achieved or trying to. They understand how important that biokinetics role is. And Kelly, you get to experience that, being the practitioner administering the services back to those athletes within that environment, putting them into that Biodex or the isokinetic machine or the Cybex and testing those limits.
You know what? Bios make everything better. So it helps to have the knowledge, the scientific theory behind it, and then apply it. But then it also it's rewarding to see someone who's come from an injury and you work with them and they get back and they're better than before and they're breaking records or doing amazing things that they never thought they could. Not to say it's us, but I think a lot of it is them, but we're there cheering them on.
Your advice for athletes out in the market, if they are struggling and need a bit of support or things, what's your advice to them if they're struggling with a niggle, an injury or something like that? What's the first protocol for them?
So I think never leave a niggle. It can develop into something huge. So always see someone, whether it's a bio, chiro, physio, have the niggle assessed and attend to it before it gets any bigger than it needs to be. If I was an athlete, I'd find a bio and work with them.
Yeah, I think for me, I would. My comment is more for the people who are looking at starting something. If you've been inactive for a while and you were previously good at something, is don't just jump straight into it. You can't jump into the deep end. It's going to cost you.
When did you last do sports?
Yeah.
In high school. Brilliant.
Okay, and I was first team rugby captain.
First team rugby in 87. Yeah.
My advice there would be is don't be scared, because often it's an embarrassing type thing to think, okay, I was like that, but look at what I'm like now. It's a completely non-judgmental assessment as well. It's to help you and assist you to make sure that you're getting the best out of your body and to push yourself within your limits, and as you get better, you will improve. So for me, my advice would be is if you're starting something new, get professional advice first before you decide to jump in.
And a biokineticist would be a good protocol for that advice, I would say. Absolutely. Well, there we go. So the advice from Kelly and Tash and biokinetics overall within the field of sport. Thank you very much for your time, ladies. Been brilliant discussing. Again, I think there's a whole lot of topics within there that we're trying not to fall into, but they're just so easy to go into, and we're going to have a few more conversations around it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, until next time, guys, you got any questions, queries, you want to ask anything of the specialist, please drop the comments down below. Have a good one. We'll chat to you in the next episode. This podcast was produced by Johan Turon and the team at Soundpatch Studio. Presented by yours truly, Steve Saunders. Interested in doing a podcast? Drop us a message on soundpatch@me.com. That's soundpatch@me.com. As always, thanks for listening and catch you on the next podcast.